The Talmud tells us that in the Holy of Holies, what was contained in the Holy of Holies? Behind that curtain, you had the Aron, the Ark. In the Aron, you had the broken tablets, the second set of tablets, and you had a Sefer Torah. There was a slab of gold on top. And from that slab of gold, you had two cherubs. These two cherubs, they were of human form, and one was male, one was female. Quoting the Gemara, the Talmud, there were times that they faced one another. This was a miracle. And there were times where they were off a little bit, and there were times they were back to back. When the Jews would visit the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, every one of the festivals, they would come to the temple and they'd pull away the curtain and they'd be able to look into the Holy of Holies. And they see the cherubs on the ark, and they would see exactly what position are they in. If they're facing one another, that meant the Jews were spiritually in a good place. As two intimate people who have a relationship, they face one another. If the relationship starts souring, what do? They slightly turn off. If they're really at odds, they're back to back. They're facing opposite directions because each one's alienated from the other one's relationship. And by the Jews seeing this, very often we believe we're at a good place, but it was a miracle. God was telling you exactly where you're at. If you're back to back, you're not in a good place. In the words of the Talmud, you're not doing the will of God. You're not behaving properly. Because if you are behaving properly, you'd be facing face to face with God. One represents God, the other one represents the Jewish people, the male and the female. The male is the dominant figure. The female is the secondary figure. The female is the Jewish people. The male represents God. So that's called face to face, means there's tremendous love. There's concern, and God attends to you, to every nuance of your need, every aspect. And if they're alienated, then he turns his face away from you. It's like a person says, I don't want to look at you, which is an indication of alienation. In the time of the first temple, when there were revealed miracles, that was a time which is obvious that God wanted his presence to be known, to be felt. You have a good relationship with your brother. Your brother drops in. He comes by. What happens? The relationship is soured. There's not even a phone call. That's what happens. The same thing with God. The first temple period where the Jews were at a special level, a good part of the time, you'd go to the temple, you saw miracles, you felt God's presence. The Jews failed.
Don't go behind the video. Philip,
And ultimately the temple was destroyed.
he can make
We
it
went
see.
into exile.
Oh.
70 years we spent in Babylon. We come back. The second temple, we're not at the same level. The relationship's not the first. First temple, we had prophecy. God openly communicated with prophets. Second temple,
Usually I'm gonna cook some
no
fish.
longer prophecy.
I'm gonna probably go out and eat.
I don't know. There's no longer prophecy. Why? Because the Jews are not where they should be. Therefore, that communication is not at that level any longer. The miracles are no longer there. The second temple did not have an ark. There was no ark in the second temple. the ark was hidden away. Right before it was destroyed, it was hidden away under the floor of the sanctuary. The second temple, there wasn't. Because the ark with the cherubs is an indication that there's some level of relationship. This, when we came back the second time, it was a totally different relationship. It wasn't the same as the first. What exactly is the function of Jewish people in existence? Our responsibility is to meet the objective of creation. What is that? To perfect ourselves and perfect the world. That God's presence should be infused and obvious in this world. If the Jew succeeds, then we're in a good place. If the Jew chooses not to do that, not to be God's partner in creation, then it's not going to happen. We studied in the Chafetz Chaim regarding the laws of what you're permitted to say, what you're not permitted to say. He writes that the person who speaks irresponsibly, we'll call Lashon Hara, you speak negative about other people, where it has no constructive value. That person has, not only is he violating the law, negative commandments, positive commandments, you're activating a force which brings terrible suffering on the Jewish people. He explains why. What's the reason? We speak about prosecution. We speak of Satan as the prosecutor of the Jewish people. We all know nobody's perfect. Nobody has a perfect record. King Solomon says in Koheles, there's no perfect tzaddik. So every record we have on it imperfections. So what's the attribute of mercy? The attribute of mercy means God does not allow Satan to prosecute the record, to audit the record. But there are times where he allows him to audit the record. When? What does Satan want to say? He comes to God, he says, the Jews are not behaving properly. So God says, I don't want you to talk about my children. The Jews are my children. I don't want you to talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. He says, but I want to talk to you about it. God says, now's not the time. Excuse me. I'll see you some other time. So if God does not allow Satan to prosecute, we merit the attribute of mercy. But if God allows him to prosecute, we have a problem. Because that means the record is being audited. Now, what happens if people speak carelessly? We speak negative about one another. We'll call Lashon Hara. Satan comes to God and says, God, you don't want me to speak badly about your children. But look the way they're speaking about one another. They're sniping at one another. They're biting at each other's neck. The speech is destructive, not constructive. So you claim you don't want me to speak. Look at them. The moment Satan points that out, God says, if that's the case, prosecute. And if Satan prosecutes, God forbid, there are very, very serious ramifications of that. Death, sickness, illness, impoverishment. So the people who actually are the cause of that, they have great culpability. It's not only the negative commandment, it's for the ramification of that, the death and whatever else, they're held accountable for that. That's the Zohar. This is the Chafetz Chaim citing the Zohar, which is the Kabbalah. Why speaking Lashon Hara has such a severe consequence more than anything else for that reason. Now, at the time of the Great Flood, the world was destroyed. The only one who survived was Noach and his family. Why? So the Torah says explicitly, he found special favor in God's eyes. That's the reason why he survived. Not because he was a tzaddik. He happened to be a tzaddik, but that's not the reason. He found special favor. So the Talmud tells us, the Gemara tells us, that during the time of the Great Flood, there were people who could be classified as tzaddikim. But at the time of justice, when God displays his attribute of justice, you cannot be perfect enough, and therefore they perished. Everybody perished during the great flood for that reason. Because that's the attribute of justice. Now, what is divine justice? Divine justice means exactness. You cannot survive it. What's human justice? Which is done by the rabbinic court, which the Torah sets up the parameters and all the protocols of that court. That's human justice. Human justice functions within the context of mercy. But what about if the human court is corrupt? God says, you don't want my justice. You don't want divine justice. Divine justice is too exacting, and you wouldn't survive it. So I created a system called human justice. And I said all the criteria and all the parameters, what it is. What happens if mankind doesn't abide by it? And there's no justice on the terrestrial level. God says the world has to have justice. And if there's no human justice, then you have to have divine justice. So therefore, the Gemara tells us that the judge who's corrupt, he carries a great level of responsibility. Because he chose to be corrupt, he's the one who's responsible that divine justice should be implemented. So he's the cause of all the suffering. And therefore God says, that judge, I will take you out. I will take your life for that. But he says, I took a bribe. It's not taking the bribe. It's corrupting justice. Because if there's no human justice, there has to be divine justice. So you're the cause of all the suffering. Because the Jew, what's his responsibility? To bring the world to perfection through the prescription, which is called the Torah. The tzaddik, who actually abides by that and is committed to that, as God provides the means, the tzaddik uses the means as God says they should be utilized and invests them as God wants them to be invested. So in essence, as we discussed yesterday, who's the tzaddik? The tzaddik is God's full partner in creation. As they say in English, it takes two to tango. God on his own, that's not what the world's about. You need human participation. Who's the participant? Who's the active partner? God is active and the tzaddik's active. The Jewish people have to be active in the positive. And if we are, the relationship, each one complements the other, the end result is what God wants, which is the world has achieved spiritual perfection through the choice of the human being. And that's what life's all about. We ourselves do not have the ability to evaluate the negativity of a sin or the lethalness of a sin and how positive a mitzvah is if one does it. To what degree we're beneficiaries. The innate, infinite value of a mitzvah. We're only mortals. How do we know? How do you know? It's what you believe. And our belief is rooted in the authenticity of the Torah. And how do we know the Torah is the word of God? Because there was a Sinai. So really, the negative result of sin, we know its level of lethalness is why? Because God said that's what it is. And the value of a mitzvah, that it's infinite. And you can't live long enough to merit and receive the reward for. How do we know that? Because God said so. But what do you believe God? This is what it's all about. One of the tenets of Judaism is to believe in reward and punishment. You don't believe in reward and punishment? Rabbi, it's not the end of the world. That ain't kosher. It's not the end of the world. I don't keep Shabbos. But don't you realize, Rabbi, that's what you say. But how do you know it? Because God said so. So the difference is you believe, the other person doesn't believe. But that's what it comes down to. After everything's said and done, even if you're knowledgeable, if you don't have the belief and the trust, it's not really relevant. So knowledge, of course, is crucial, essential, but it's not enough. You need the belief and you need the trust. And if those two components, which are core components, are not there, then you're nowhere. And just to the contrary, there's even greater culpability. Being so knowledgeable, how do you turn your back on God? Well, from my experience, I can't trust him. He didn't come through for me in the past. That's what you say. That means you're passing judgment on God. If the person does that, he's not in a good place. I once gave a lecture about the Jews being the chosen people. We're chosen. We're the holy people, we're the kingly priestly people, and we're the chosen people. So now the question is, and you're trying to give a person a sense of his value. Do you realize you're chosen? Many years ago, my father had a sales rep, and he gave him a tremendous amount of business, and he asked him to contribute to a kollel that I was involved in, which is called Kiruv, to bring Jews back to Judaism. So this man, his name was Green. His name was Green. It was a very large sales rep company. He says, I don't believe in proselytizing. That's not my thing. So my father, although Hashem left it at that. So I said to my father, Dad, I want to explain you something. If you take a person who's not a Christian and you do missionary work, that's called proselytizing. But a Jew is a Jew, and the heritage is rightfully his. And you're only sensitizing him to what's rightfully his. That's not called proselytizing. A lawyer has an inheritance, $100 million inheritance, and he contacts this person who was left for. He says, I have $100 million inheritance, so you want to come to the office? I need you to sign some papers. But you realize you're taking over my life by giving me that kind of money. I'm taking over your life. I'm giving you what's rightfully yours. You don't want it? Don't take it. But here with our heritage, you have no choice. Because when God took us at Sinai as being his people, he says, you must abide by my prescription of life if you want to have a share in eternity. Otherwise, you're not worthy. It's not proselytizing. So God gives us the means. If he wants us to succeed, he has to give us the means. We read in Pirkei Avos, it means Kemach in Torah. If there's no bread, if there's no flour, there's no Torah. We're physical beings. We have to address our physicality. Person has to eat, you have to sleep, you have to do many things. You have to take breaks every once in a while. Person's not a machine. It means Kemach in Torah. So the question now is, if a person reaches a point where he can't continue because he can't put food on the table. So you have a question on God. God, it may kemach Torah. So if there's be Torah, you have to provide the kemach. So why don't I have the means? Good question. We have many questions about God, but usually the answer is the wrong answer. So the Orach Chaim HaKodesh explains, Im ein kemach, ein Torah. That's the indication. Okay, it's not the real thing. You may believe it's Torah, but it's so paltry, it's so lacking, it doesn't meet the grade. Tell you a story, personal story. When the Russians first came from Russia And the yeshiva hired a man. He was an older man. He must have been in his late 60s. And he claimed he was a cabinet maker in Europe, in Russia. And they had very little. And my family was growing. And we needed chairs around the kitchen table wasn't enough. And my children were young. And I said to him, I need a bench. Could you build a bench for me? Okay. I once told the story. So he builds a bench. He delivers it to my home. He found wood. One board was painted green, another one pink, another one another color. He hammered it together. My kids sit on the bench. It wasn't reinforced. It collapses. And he didn't even sand it down. So the kids were getting splinters. So originally I asked him, how much does it cost? This bench that he made before it collapsed. He says, $50. I said, not a problem. Because I wanted to give him charity. He was too proud to take charity. It was a way I could give him something. So I said to him, afterwards, when it collapses, he says, I built it. He says, if you want me to fix it, it's going to cost you. I said, in terms of the quality of the work, the wood that you use, the material, it seemed to be a pretty high price. He says, you know how many hours I built this bench? It took me 15 hours. The answer is, it's irrelevant how many hours it took you to build it. The question is, what's it worth? If you go based on your investment of time and money in it, if it doesn't meet the grade, it's worthless. You understand? I'm trying my best. I'm doing my best. The question, what did you accomplish? Imein kemach ein Torah. If God doesn't provide the bread, you know what that tells you? What you're delivering is not the real thing. It's so paltry. It's so lacking in what it's supposed to be. Yeah, but my wife lights Sabbath candles after sundown, Friday night. She goes with a Hebrew name every time we go to Israel. You understand? But that's not what Judaism's about. Lighting Sabbath candles after sundown. That's called desecration of Shabbos. And going with a Hebrew name means nothing. It means living by what God says the way the Jew has to live. That connects you to the source. A person drinks vitamin water. It's called vitamin water. Whatever you want to call it. Because he read an article that over time, you're going to disappear. If you're overweight, within time, you're going to take off loads of weight. The question is, and eat nothing else but take the vitamin water. The question is, in 2 weeks, are you still alive? That's the question. You can't live on vitamin water. But it says it's filled with vitamins, but that's not enough to keep you alive. It seems to be Torah, because I bought that Hebrew book, and I glance at it once in a while, and I play Hava Nagila, and I play it on the plane, even though El Al doesn't play it any longer, but I have it in my earphones, and I play it. I feel enthralled with this, but that doesn't make you a Jew. That doesn't connect you to your spirituality. Imein kemach ein Torah. Who's the true partner of God? The tzaddik. Because the tzaddik is participating as a true partner. You sit in the executive vice president's office, sit in the chair, and you do nothing all day, and you have that $25 scar on your mouth, and you earn no income, and you wear that $5,000 suit. You know what that's for the company? Nothing. You're just occupying space. You're going through motions. It means nothing. The shutif, the real partner, is that tzaddik. But he looks like an arcane Jew. I wouldn't be caught dead in that frock that he wears. You're right, because your shrouds are going to look different. You're going to wear a tuxedo in that box with the patent leather shoes. You're never going to look like that tzaddik, not in life and not in death. It's interesting. Person graduates MIT top grades in economics, and they take him in the top corporation as They even give them profit sharing and a semi-partnership. Another person asks, why do they pass over me? They ask, what's your credentials? Well, I graduate PS 49 and I went to whatever it is, Seward Park High School. You mean you didn't go to Bronx Science? Even as a high school student, you weren't where you should have been. And you want to be a partner in this corporation. You're equating yourself to a guy who graduated MIT with all kinds of awards. Well, I think I'm qualified. You can think what you want. As they say, proof's in the pudding. So who's God's shutif? Who's God's partner? The tzaddik. God provides the means. Right? You're supposed to bake a cake. If you don't know how to bake a cake, I wouldn't want to eat that cake. The pastry chef, he's the expert. He or she knows how to bake that cake. The tzaddik knows exactly how to take the ingredients and follow instructions and come out with something very special. But I want to make this point, it's a very important point. A person doesn't have a background in Judaism, and he's learning, and he's doing his best. And he's a late starter, and he's truly doing his best. Although he hasn't accomplished what a person who's been observant all his life, there's no claim against him. Because in truth, he is doing his best. It's a very important point, because the evil inclination always wants to discourage you to say, and even if you do it, what are you going to accomplish? What do you think? You have so many years left. Where do you think you're going to arrive at? Do you think you can be that or that? You have to be who you're supposed to be. And as long as you do your best, God doesn't ask more than doing your best. A new question, are you doing your best? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Are you doing your best? There's a famous story. I don't tell them Hasidic stories. There was a story with the Rebbe Reb Zusha, and he was walking through the street, and he sees the light on in a shoemaker's shop, 2 a.m, and he knocks on the door, and the shoemaker is still working on shoes, fixing shoes. So he says to him, it's 2 a.m. Why don't you go to sleep? So he said to him, as long as the light burns, I work. No, it's a poor man. As long as the candle is burning, I work. Candle goes out, then I stop working. It touched him very strongly. As long as you're alive, you function. God forbid, once that light goes out, you can't do anything any longer. That was his takeaway. As long as the light burns, I work. As long as we're able to be functioning, take advantage of the moment. Because you never know when that moment is come to end. And that's an inspiration.